Picture this. You are a powerful nobleman in the year 1184, seated in a grand hall surrounded by 60 of the most important men in all of Europe. Kings, bishops, military commanders, all gathered to decide the fate of nations. The room is filled with the weight of history being made. And then, without warning, the floor beneath you explodes into splinters. You are falling through darkness, tumbling through broken wood and stone. And when you finally hit the bottom, you realize with absolute horror that you are drowning in a pit of human waste so deep that your screams for help are drowned out by the screams of dozens of other men dying around you. This is not a nightmare. This actually happened. 60 of the most powerful men in medieval Germany died this way on a single afternoon, and the thing that killed them was not a sword, not poison, not a battle. It was a toilet. The medieval bathroom was one of the deadliest places you could possibly be, and by the end of this video, you will never look at a castle the same way again. You will understand why sitting down in the wrong place at the wrong time could get you assassinated, burned alive, or drowned in filth. And you will discover that this was not just a medieval problem. People were still dying this exact same way well into the 20th century. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Let us start with the basics, because if you do not understand how medieval toilets were designed, you cannot understand why they were so incredibly dangerous. Forget everything you think you know about bathrooms. In medieval Europe, toilets were not rooms with plumbing and running water. They were called garderobes, and the name literally means a place where you guard your robes, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval priorities. These were small stone chambers built directly into the outer walls of castles, usually on the second or third floor. The design was brutally simple. You walked into a tiny alcove barely wide enough to turn around in. There was a wooden bench or a stone seat with a circular hole cut through it. And beneath that hole was absolutely nothing but open air and a drop that could be anywhere from 50 feet to 200 feet straight down to the ground below. No pipes, no water, no safety features whatsoever. When you sat down and did your business, gravity pulled everything straight down through the hole, down through a long stone or wooden shaft built into the wall, and eventually into a cesspit dug into the ground at the base of the castle. That was the entire system. Gravity and a hole in the wall. Now you might be thinking, well, that sounds primitive, but at least it is functional. And you would be right. It was functional, but it was also a death trap waiting to spring on anyone unlucky enough to use it at the wrong moment. Here's why. Those wooden seats and the wooden support beams holding them in place were constantly exposed to moisture rising up from the cesspit below. Medieval castles were cold, damp environments where wood rotted incredibly fast, and these particular pieces of wood were being soaked in humidity and chemical fumes 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Carpenters were supposed to inspect and replace the rotting beams regularly, but in reality, maintenance was expensive and time-consuming, so it often got delayed or ignored completely. And that meant that every time someone sat down on one of these toilets, they were gambling with their life. If the wood had rotted through, the entire seat could collapse without warning, sending the person plunging down the shaft. And falling down a toilet shaft was not like falling off a horse or tripping on stairs. This was a fall of 50 to 200 feet in pitch-black darkness through a narrow stone tube slick with filth. If you survived the impact at the bottom, and most people did not, you landed in a cesspit filled with liquid sewage deep enough to drown in. There are documented cases throughout medieval records of servants, nobles, and even members of royal families falling through toilet floors and dying this way. One chronicler from the 13th century wrote about a knight who fell through a garderobe seat during a feast and was not discovered until 3 days later when workers finally climbed down into the pit to retrieve his body. His family had been searching the entire castle for him, never imagining he had fallen through the bathroom floor. But structural collapse was just the beginning of the dangers, because those cesspits at the bottom of the shafts were not just pools of waste. They were chemical weapons waiting to detonate. As human waste decomposed in the oxygen-poor environment at the bottom of a deep pit, it produced enormous quantities of methane gas. Methane is colorless, and when mixed with the overwhelming stench of sewage, it is basically odorless to the human nose. But it is also extremely flammable. In fact, methane does not just burn. It explodes. And medieval people loved using torches and candles because, well, they did not have electricity. So imagine this scenario. A servant walks into a garderobe at night carrying a candle to light the way. The methane concentration in the shaft has been building up for weeks because nobody has emptied the pit recently. The servant holds the candle near the toilet hole to see what they are doing. The methane ignites, and suddenly there is an explosion powerful enough to blow chunks of sewage across the servant instantly. This was not a rare occurrence. It happened regularly enough that medieval chronicles mention it multiple times. In 1298, at Guildford Castle in England, a worker died when he brought a torch too close to a garderobe opening, and the methane exploded with such force that it cracked the foundation of the tower he was standing in. The blast was heard a mile away. But here is the truly insane part. Castle builders knew this was happening. They knew the pits produced flammable gas. They knew people were dying in explosions. And they kept building toilets the exact same way because during sieges, that methane became a weapon they could use against attackers. Now let us talk about something even more terrifying than accidental death. Deliberate murder. Because medieval assassins figured out very quickly that toilet shafts were the perfect way to infiltrate a heavily defended castle. Think about it from a tactical perspective. Castles were designed to be impenetrable fortresses. Thick walls, narrow windows, heavily guarded gates, archers on every tower. Getting inside without being seen was nearly impossible, unless you were willing to do something absolutely disgusting. The toilet shafts were one of the only openings in the entire castle that led directly from the outside world into the private living quarters of the nobility. And while the idea of climbing up a sewage chute filled with human waste sounds insane, it was actually brilliant from an assassination standpoint. Guards were not watching the toilet shafts because who in their right mind would climb up one? The shafts were dark, hidden, and led straight to the most private rooms in the castle where people were alone and vulnerable. So if you were a determined assassin hired to kill a nobleman, you would wait until nightfall, climb into the cesspit at the base of the castle wall, and start making your way up the shaft. The walls of these shafts were rough stone, which meant you could get handholds and footholds as you climbed. It was disgusting, it was dangerous, but it was possible. And once you reached the top, you waited. You waited in complete silence in absolute darkness, crouched inside a stone tube barely wider than your shoulders, breathing toxic fumes, until your target came into the garderobe to relieve themselves. They would sit down on the toilet seat, completely unaware that you were directly below them. And then you would strike upward through the hole with a dagger or a spear, stabbing them from below while they were trapped in a tiny room with no escape. The victim would die almost instantly, and you would disappear back down the shaft before anyone even realized what had happened. There would be no witnesses, no evidence, nothing but a body slumped over a toilet seat. And because people did occasionally die from falling through toilet floors or from methane poisoning, it was entirely plausible that the death was an accident. This was not just theoretical. It actually happened. In 1203, a French nobleman named Edmund was assassinated exactly this way. An enemy hired a killer to climb up the toilet shaft in Edmund's castle and stab him while he was using the garderobe. Edmund died instantly, and his servants found him hours later. The initial assumption was that he had suffered some kind of medical emergency while on the toilet, which was not uncommon in medieval times. It was only years later, after the assassin confessed on his deathbed, that anyone realized it had been murder. Once castle lords figured out that their toilets were being used as infiltration points, they started installing iron gratings at the bottom of the shafts to prevent people from climbing up. These were heavy iron bars set into the stone, spaced close enough together that a human body could not fit through. Problem solved, right? Wrong. Because now you had a different problem. The iron gratings would get clogged with solid waste, creating backups that made the toilets completely unusable. The sewage would pile up in the shaft until it overflowed back into the garderobe chamber, flooding the bathroom with filth. And the only way to fix it was to send someone down into the pit to manually clear the blockage. This job was so dangerous and so disgusting that it was assigned to criminals or people who were so poor they had no other choice. These workers were called Gong farmers, and they had perhaps the worst job in all of human history. Let me paint a picture for you of what life was like as a Gong farmer in medieval Europe. Your job was to climb down into cesspits that could be 20 feet deep, filled with years' worth of accumulated human waste, and shovel it out by hand into buckets. You did this work exclusively at night because the smell was so overpowering that if you tried to do it during the day, the entire town would riot. Citizens would literally attack you in the streets because the stench was that unbearable. You earned good money for this work, far more than a typical laborer, but that was only because nobody else was willing to do it. The mortality rate for Gong farmers was staggering. You were facing 3 different ways to die on every single shift. First, there was the methane. As you disturbed the waste by shoveling it, you released massive plumes of methane and hydrogen sulfide gas that had been trapped beneath the surface. If you were carrying a lantern for light, which you absolutely needed because you were working in total darkness, the methane could ignite and cause an explosion that would incinerate you alive. There are records of Gong farmers being burned so badly that their bodies were unrecognizable. Second, if the methane concentration got high enough, it could displace all the oxygen in the pit. You would take a breath and get nothing but toxic gas. You would be unconscious in seconds and dead in minutes, suffocating at the bottom of a sewage pit with no one able to reach you in time. And third, even if you avoided the gas, there was always the risk of simply slipping and falling face first into the muck. If you were knocked unconscious when you hit your head, you would drown before anyone could pull you out. One of the most famous Gong farmer deaths in history happened in London in 1326. A man named Richard was hired to clean out a particularly deep cesspit beneath a wealthy merchant's home. He climbed down into the pit with his shovel and bucket, and within minutes he was overcome by the fumes. He collapsed face down into the sewage and drowned before his partner at the surface could even react. When they finally pulled his body out hours later, the official report simply said accidental death, and the pit went back into regular use the very next day. No investigation, no safety changes, nothing. Because in medieval society, the life of a Gong farmer was considered expendable. But sometimes the danger was not just for the workers. Sometimes entire buildings full of important people were at risk, and when those buildings failed, the consequences changed history. July 26, 1184. Erfurt, Germany. This is a date that should be as famous as any medieval battle, but most people have never heard of it. King Henry VI, one of the most powerful rulers in all of Europe, had called a meeting of the Imperial Diet. For those of you who do not know, the Diet was essentially a parliament where kings, bishops, princes, and military commanders gathered to make decisions about wars, taxes, and political alliances. This particular meeting was held in a building called the Petersburg Citadel, and it was supposed to resolve a major dispute that had been threatening to tear the Holy Roman Empire apart. The meeting was scheduled to take place in a large hall on the second floor of a stone building that had been constructed specifically to host gatherings like this. The room was grand by medieval standards, with high ceilings, tapestries on the walls, long wooden tables, and enough space to comfortably hold maybe 40 people. But on this day, more than 60 men crowded into the hall. We are talking about princes in full armor, bishops in heavy robes, knights wearing chainmail, all packed into a space that was not designed to hold that much weight. And directly beneath that hall, built into the foundation of the building, was a monastery latrine, a cesspit that had been in continuous use for years, possibly decades, without ever being properly emptied or maintained. The wooden floor of the hall was supported by beams that extended across the room and rested on stone supports at either end. But those beams had been slowly rotting from exposure to moisture and methane gas rising up from the cesspit below. And now, with the weight of 60 armored men pressing down from above, those beams were at their absolute breaking point. At approximately noon, witnesses outside the building heard a sound like thunder, and then screaming. The entire floor of the hall collapsed all at once. 60 men plunged through splintering wood, crashing through the first floor, then smashing through the second floor, and finally falling into the monastery latrine below. It was a drop of roughly 15 to 20 feet, and many of the men died on impact. Their necks snapped, their skulls shattered, their spines broken when they hit the stone bottom of the pit, or when other men in full armor landed directly on top of them. But the ones who survived the fall faced something arguably worse. They were now submerged in a pool of liquid human waste that was deep enough to drown in. The pit was pitch black. The air was filled with toxic gas, and the men were disoriented, injured, choking on sewage, unable to see or breathe, or find any solid ground to grab onto. The ones who managed to grab broken beams or cling to the edges of the collapsed floor screamed for help, but the rescue efforts were agonizingly slow. Why? Because the methane gas rising from the disturbed waste was so concentrated that bringing torches into the area risked triggering a massive explosion that would kill the rescuers and any survivors still clinging to life. So they had to work in near total darkness, trying to pull men out one at a time while the fumes were burning their lungs and making them dizzy. King Henry himself only survived because he had been seated in a stone alcove at the far end of the hall that did not collapse. He watched the entire thing happen. He watched his closest advisors, his military commanders, men he had known for decades, disappear into the floor. He heard them screaming, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to save them. By the time rescue teams managed to pull the last survivor out, it had been hours. 60 men were dead. 60 of the most powerful, important, influential people in the entire Holy Roman Empire, killed in a single afternoon by a toilet. And the political consequences were staggering. Entire regions lost their rulers. Military campaigns had to be abandoned because the commanders were dead. Alliances collapsed. Succession disputes erupted. The Erfurt Latrine Disaster changed the political map of Europe, and it is one of the most bizarre mass casualty events in all of recorded history. But even if you managed to avoid falling through the floor, avoid assassins climbing up from below, and avoid methane explosions, you still were not safe. Because medieval toilets were breeding grounds for diseases that killed millions of people across Europe. Let me explain how this worked. The cesspit at the bottom of the toilet shaft was an ideal environment for bacteria. It was warm, moist, oxygen-poor, and filled with organic matter. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and dozens of other deadly pathogens thrived in these conditions. And because there was no running water, no U-bend in the pipes, no barriers of any kind between the cesspit and the living quarters above, those bacteria had a direct route up into the castle. Rats lived in the cesspits, feeding on the waste, and then they would climb up the rough stone walls of the toilet shafts and emerge into bedrooms, kitchens, dining halls. These rats carried fleas infected with the bubonic plague, and when they made their way into human living spaces, they spread the plague with terrifying efficiency. The Black Death, which killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's entire population in the 14th century, spread so quickly in part because medieval sanitation was so catastrophically bad. The toilet shafts were highways for disease to travel from the filthiest part of the castle directly into the most private areas. Flies were even worse. flies bred by the millions in the warm sewage of the cesspits. And then they flew straight up through the toilet shafts into the castle. They landed on food in the kitchens, on people's faces while they slept, on open wounds. Every single fly was carrying bacteria from the cesspit on its legs and body. And medieval people had no concept of germ theory, so they did not understand why they kept getting sick. They believed in something called miasma, the idea that bad smells cause disease. And in a way, they were right. The places that smelled the worst were the places with the most bacteria. But they did not understand the mechanism. They thought the smell itself was the problem, so they would try to cover it up with perfumes and herbs instead of actually cleaning the source of the contamination. In monasteries, the monks had communal latrines called reredorators where 20 or 30 men would sit side by side on long wooden benches, all relieving themselves at the same time. You might think this was more efficient, but imagine the spread of disease in a room like that. If one monk came down with dysentery, which causes severe diarrhea, the entire monastery could be infected within days. And the worst part? They shared cleaning tools. After finishing, monks would use a communal sponge attached to a stick, dip it in a bucket of water or vinegar, and wipe themselves. Then they would put the sponge back in the bucket for the next person to use. This shared sponge was essentially a biological weapon, transferring bacteria from person to person with ruthless efficiency. Strangely, medieval people actually believed that hanging their clothes inside the toilet shaft was beneficial. They thought the ammonia smell from the urine would kill fleas and lice living in their woolen tunics. And to be fair, ammonia is a mild insecticide, so it probably did annoy the bugs. But it also meant that everyone walked around wearing clothes that had been marinating in toilet fumes. Their understanding of hygiene was so fundamentally different from ours that it is almost hard to comprehend. They were trying to solve one problem, lice, but they were creating a much bigger problem, constant exposure to airborne bacteria and toxic fumes. The toilet was not just a convenience. It was a central part of the cycle of life and death in medieval society. Now here is where things get really dark. During medieval sieges, the toilet system became a strategic weapon that could determine who won or lost a battle. When an enemy army surrounded a castle and cut off all supply lines, the defenders inside had to survive on whatever food and water they had stockpiled. Sieges could last for months, and during that entire time, human waste kept piling up in the cesspits. But instead of letting that waste become a liability, clever defenders figured out how to turn it into an offensive weapon. They would heat the sewage in massive iron cauldrons over fires until it was boiling, and then they would carry those cauldrons up to the battlements and pour the boiling waste down on attackers who were trying to climb the walls or position siege equipment close to the castle. Boiling human waste was actually more effective than boiling water because it was thicker, so it stuck to armor and clothing instead of just splashing off. It would burn through leather, blister skin, seep into gaps in chainmail, and cause horrific infections. And the psychological impact was devastating. Imagine being a soldier trying to scale a wall and suddenly being drenched in boiling sewage. Even if you survived, you were now covered in filth, you stank, you were humiliated, and you probably just contracted 3 different diseases. Some castles even designed their toilet chutes to angle outward specifically so defenders could drop waste directly onto enemies below. And then there was the methane. During desperate sieges, defenders discovered that if they could ignite the gas rising from their cesspits, they could create fireballs that would scatter attackers and set wooden siege towers ablaze. It was incredibly dangerous because the explosion could just as easily affect the defenders as the attackers, but it worked often enough that people kept doing it. So the same design flaw that made castles deadly to live in also made them nearly impossible to conquer. Medieval lords accepted the daily risk of toilet-related death. During wartime, those same toilets could save their lives. Here is the part that should genuinely disturb you. We did not actually stop building dangerous toilets when the medieval period ended. The garderobe design, with minor modifications, persisted well into the 18th and even 19th centuries because it was cheap, simple, and did not require skilled engineers to construct. In rural areas and older buildings, people were still using toilet systems nearly identical to medieval garderobes well into the industrial age. And people were still dying from them. In 1895, more than 700 years after the Erfurt disaster, a hotel in Switzerland experienced almost the exact same tragedy. The hotel had been built in the 1700s and still used an old-style cesspit system beneath its guest floors. During a large banquet, the floor of the dining hall gave way and dropped 12 people into the sewage pit below. 11 of them drowned before rescuers could reach them. The official investigation blamed poor maintenance and outdated construction, but the design was fundamentally identical to the one that had killed those 60 nobles in 1184. Same architectural flaw, same preventable tragedy, same refusal to change the system until enough people died to force legal reforms. It was not until the early 20th century, when modern building codes and public health regulations were written, that we finally stopped putting toilets over open cesspits. And those regulations were written in blood. Every rule about proper sewage disposal, about ventilation, about structural safety, exists because people died. Lots of people, over hundreds of years. But if you visit medieval castles today as a tourist, those garderobes are still there. You can walk into them, look down the chutes, take pictures. And most people have absolutely no idea that they are standing in rooms that killed more people than most medieval battles. Some of those toilet shafts drop 200 feet straight down to pits that have not been cleaned in centuries. And if you ever tour a castle and the guide shows you a garderobe, I want you to do something for me. Look down into that hole. Think about the fact that people sat exactly where you were standing and never got back up. So here's my question for you, and I really want to know your answer. If you lived in a medieval castle, would you use the garderobe knowing all of these risks? Or would you just use a chamber pot in your bedroom and deal with the smell? Let me know in the comments because I am genuinely curious how you would weigh convenience versus survival. And if you think this story is disturbing, next week I am going to tell you about the siege where they weaponized live rats by forcing them up through the toilet shafts into enemy fortifications. It is one of the most twisted military tactics in history, and you will not believe how it ended. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.